Hey, welcome back to 316, a Bible study of Bridgeway Church out of Tampa, Florida. My name is Joel Eason. I serve as the senior pastor at Bridgeway, and on behalf of our church, welcome. We're excited that you're joining us for this study. For all our regulars, we love having you for these. And for anybody that might be new with us, we'd love to have you check out our information at our website as well as on this channel, where we love to go verse by verse where we can and take a comprehensive view where maybe time doesn't allow us to go verse by verse. And so I think if you look through our catalog of videos and teachings that we've covered as we've gone through all of the Apostle Paul, we've gone through much of the New Testament, the Gospels, and the prophets over in the Old Testament. I think that those will be of benefit for you. Now, we find ourselves in this study in the Gospel of John, and we're in part 5. Part 5 for us will be John chapter 8 and 9. And so I'm going to go ahead and hop over to our view where we're able to walk through some things. Now, I think it's important to kind of know where we've been and what sets up John chapter 8 and chapter 9. And that would be where we left off. John chapter 7 is very important, I feel, for understanding John chapter 8 and John chapter 9. We established from the beginning of John chapter 7, we're going into the Feast of Tabernacles. It states that very clearly in John 7. That means that the people of Israel are going to be traveling to Jerusalem, Jesus included. Jesus' brothers are saying you should go. And there was going to be this discussion about not going, but Jesus is going to go. And of these Feast of Tabernacles, of the Feast of Tabernacles, it was one of 3 pilgrimage feasts for the Jewish people, and it was 7 days long. Now, let me show you something we looked at last week. Of the 7 primary feasts that the Jewish people have, you would have Passover, followed immediately by the Feast of Unleavened Bread, followed by the First Fruits, and then you would have Pentecost. And in those first 4, those are the spring feasts. Those happened in the spring calendar. And the Passover and Pentecost, those were pilgrim feasts. People would make a journey to Jerusalem, specifically the men. Most people, but for sure the men would travel. And then when you got into the fall season, you had these 3 others. The Feast of Trumpets, today we know that as Rosh Hashanah. You would have the Day of Atonement, that's known as Yom Kippur. And then you would have the Feast of Tabernacles, Sukkot. This could also be called the Feast of Booths, because around Jerusalem, people would establish or set up tents, little tabernacles, little booths, and they would stay in these. And it was a celebration of how God had provided for their ancestors in the wilderness. And there's a big celebration to this. Now, keeping that in mind, that is 7 days. We pushed in also that there is really an 8th day that follows it, because you would have Sabbath, and you would have the 7 days of Sukkot, and then you would have the 8th day, which was a Sabbath, and you would have this kind of celebration where people many times came back to the temple for worship, and they would return home for disassembling their tents or booths and then travel home. And so we looked at John chapter 7, and it said, on the last and greatest day of the feast, Jesus stood and said in a loud voice, if anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the scripture said, streams of living water will flow from within him. Now, this was last week, but this is important to this week. And I want to show you something that we did not look at last week that shows up in this study. And that would be the pool of Siloam. If you see this water pool down at the bottom of the image, what happened at the Feast of Tabernacles is on the first 6 days, once a day, a priest would come down to the pool of Siloam, bring a pitcher of water all the way up that pathway that you can kind of see going to the temple, and he would come to the temple and pour this water out at the temple, at the altar. On the seventh day, it was custom that the priest would come down to the pool of Siloam, gather this water, and then he would encircle around the altar 7 times and then pour out the water. And it's in this backdrop that Jesus is making this landmark statement that you see here. If anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink, because I have living water, and from him will flow living water that'll never cease. So this is a very poignant statement connected to the Feast of Tabernacles. Some of the statements you see in chapter 8 and chapter 9 will do so as well. Now, chapter 7 finishes with Nicodemus being amongst the Pharisees. They're going to have dialogue and debate about Jesus. But look at verse 53. Then each went to his own home. So this is, they're going to their booth or they're going to their home. Even those that lived in Jerusalem would have established a tent or a booth tent out front of their home in some capacity. They would reside for that week in these tents. So watch this. John chapter 8 is picking up as Feast of Tabernacles is finishing, and it is that 8th day. It is the Sabbath where many people come to the temple for this last form of worship. So all of chapter 8 and chapter 9 are going to play out in that context. But Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. At dawn, this is the next day, he appeared again in the temple courts where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery." And so I leaned a little bit last time on that this could have been a man that had traveled without his family, and he was residing in a booth fashioned for that week. Could have been any number of things. There's a lot of speculation on the context of this individual who had sinned with this woman. But we know that these Pharisees are going to bring only the woman. That's going to be part of the trap towards Jesus. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say? They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. Now you'll see on your screen here, this is coming from Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 22. Let me say this. When the Pharisees are trying to trap Jesus, they will take something out of the Mosaic law and they will attempt to pervert it and make Jesus try and respond in a way that causes consternation or division amongst people in how this is interpreted. So you'll see here, they're hoping that Jesus chooses one of these fashions. Either A, he doesn't judge the woman. He does nothing at all. Well, to them, they would say that he doesn't uphold the Mosaic law. Number 2, they do exactly what Jesus does, exactly what they're asking, and he judges this woman. Well, you're going to see that Deuteronomy 22, verse 22, also includes the man. And they will push on Jesus only pushing or promoting and upholding partial portions of Mosaic law. Or C, Jesus is going to judge both the man and the woman, and on the tail end of the Feast of Tabernacles, be calling for an execution. This would absolutely polarize his audience, even though it was from the law. So let me show you Deuteronomy 22, verse 22. If a man is found sleeping with another man's wife, both the man who slept with her and the woman must die. You must purge the evil from Israel. So they're trying to get Jesus to either do nothing, to make an indictment on the woman alone, which would be polarizing to the law of Moses, or make a judgment about this man who is mysteriously not there. That's why the man's not there, because the Pharisees are attempting to create a push where Jesus has to go one direction or the other. And if Jesus calls for this man also and calls for the stoning of both of them, talk about polarization on the tail end of the Feast of Tabernacles. So it goes back to John. It says, "But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, 'If any of you is without sin, let him be the first to throw a stone at her.' Again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. A lot of people speculate and wonder what he wrote, and nobody can concretely say what he wrote. I will give you a consideration that a number of scholars suggest, and that comes out of Jeremiah 17. Before you get to Jeremiah 17, here's why Jesus says what he says, in my estimation, is according to Deuteronomy 17. Remember, the Pharisees are coming and they're trying to get Jesus to indict and create a form of judgment, a verdict against this woman. Moses said we should stone her. What do you say? Do you agree with the law of Moses, or do you call for partial understanding, or are we supposed to stone her? Watch this. In Deuteronomy 17, it says, on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, a man shall be put to death, but no one shall be put to death on the testimony of only one witness. They are trying to put the burden of guilt on Jesus, and the reason Jesus says, whoever of you is without sin, let him cast the first stone. He is upholding the law of Moses by saying, one of you has to partner with me first in judgment. Because you brought her here, you are making an indictment upon her, and one of you has to step up and say, my name's on this. And so he says, whoever of you is without sin, whoever of you is the lead prosecutor on this woman, let him cast the first stone. Watch this. The hands of the witnesses must be the first in putting him to death, and then the hands of all the people. So the reason that God has this with the law of Moses, if you read through this context of Deuteronomy, God was safeguarding the people from false accusations. If somebody was going to bring a false accusation against you, they couldn't just back out and say, no, hey, my bad, I just didn't have enough information. If you made an accusation and you threw stones, the blood of the person was on your name. It was on your family line. So Jesus is pushing this back into their court and saying, which of you is going to throw the first stone and put the blood of this lady upon your family, because you have to step up first. To which none of them are going to do it. Now, why does he write in the ground? Why is he writing in the dirt? That's an interesting thing. A number of scholars will point to this. Jeremiah 17. O Lord, the hope of Israel, all who forsake you will be put to shame. Those who turn away from you will be written in the dust, because they have forsaken the Lord, the spring of living water. Remember, this is still happening on Feast of Tabernacles celebration. What had just happened the day before? This announcement, I am the living water. If anyone wants to drink water, let him drink of me. I'll give you water that'll never cease to flow. The very next day, as part of this Feast of Tabernacles, John does what he commonly does, takes an event to then give a sermon. And he's going to push into this idea here of writing in the dust, I think connected to Jeremiah 17. But back to John 8, at this, those who heard began to go away one at a time. The older ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? No one, sir, she said. Then neither do I condemn you. Jesus declared, Go now and leave your life of sin. So first and foremost, I love the fact that Jesus says, Where are those who condemn you? Neither do I condemn you. I love the fact that he extends to you and me, extends to her, extends to us all a grace that only he can extend. When other people want to judge us, when other people want to indict us with some verdict of guilt or shame or what have you, I love that the grace of the Lord is looking for extending grace rather than punishment. And that's true in your life and my life as well. Now, one of the things that I just said it earlier, one of the things that John would regularly do is take an event that happens and then give a sermon. Jesus would give a sermon following it. John documents this. Event, sermon. So you have the Feast of Tabernacles as an event. You have this woman being brought to him. And then for the remainder of John chapter 8, Jesus is going to be preaching, teaching, and in debate, confrontation with Pharisees. So watch what is said next. When Jesus spoke again to the people, this is still the same moment. This has not changed. This is not a different day. This is not way down the line. This is same moment, same day. When Jesus spoke again to the people, he said, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. What a fantastic statement, and one that many of us know about. I am the light of the world. They're still at the temple. This is still the 8th day following the Feast of Tabernacles. Here's why that's important. I'm going to show you an image because, people try and do renderings as best they can, but there's something you might want to look into called the illumination of the temple. So as you're looking at this image, let me just kind of talk about it. At the Feast of Tabernacles, there was a custom for the Jewish people to light these 4 incredibly tall lamps. They would erect them and set them up for the Feast of Tabernacles. What I've read in different studies is that they were up to about 75 feet, very tall, multiple ladders to get to the height of them, full of oil, and that they would burn. In the Talmud, the Jewish Talmud, it records that when you had the Feast of Tabernacles and these lamps would be burning through the entirety of the week, a lot like what you and I watch with the Olympics, when they would burn through the night, that the Talmud would declare not one home in Jerusalem would not glow from its light. I don't remember the exact verbiage, but it was the idea that not a home in Jerusalem wouldn't be touched by the glow of the burning of the lamps at the temple. So you have these very tall lamps. Well, at the conclusion of the Feast of Tabernacles, these lights would be put out, and then these very tall, massive lamps would be taken down. It is in this backdrop, once again, similar to I'm the living water, if anyone wants water, and this in the face of priests pouring out water from the pool of Siloam. Here, in the illumination of the temple, you think about the very end, as light is gone, it's dark now, it's there. And this would have been during the day, but I'm saying it's not burning anymore. And Jesus says, I am the light of the world. It just takes on a very poignant kind of understanding in the context that he's given it at the conclusion of the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, from verse 12 to 59, there's going to be back and forth because of this statement. The Pharisees are going to challenge Jesus' testimony and his authority to speak in the temple under these kind of regards. Jesus is going to say that he is validated by the Father, because once again, you saw it just a while ago, 2 or 3 witnesses, no one testifies of themselves. And that's consistent all through the law of Moses. Well, I'll show you just kind of a hybrid of verses here. Verse 13, the Pharisees challenged him, here you are appearing as your own witness. Your testimony is not valid, because they're saying nobody testifies on your behalf. You didn't have a mentor that presented you. Jesus says in verse 18, I am one who testifies for myself. My other witness is the Father who sent me. So he is indicating that the Father in heaven is my witness. They are going to ask him, where is your Father? Jesus is going to reply, you don't know me or my Father. Now pause here. When they say this line, where is your Father? This is really a very underhand swipe at Mary, because the Jewish predominant against Jesus position was that Jesus was an illegitimate child. They did not believe this divine birth from Mary. They held that Jesus was an illegitimate child, not Joseph's child. And so that is pushed in a couple places in the gospel against him. And so this statement of where is your Father is an indictment saying you have no dad. or your dad is not known. And Jesus is going to push, you don't know my Father. And then you jump ahead to verse 29. He's going to say, the one who sent me is with me. He has not left me alone, for I always do what pleases him. Even as he spoke, many put their faith in him. So you love that line, or I love that line, verse 29, for I always do what pleases him. I mean, think for a second, what would it be like if that were really accurate of you and me? If we could say, I always do what pleases him. There is only one who always does what pleases the Father. Scripture tells us in the book of Romans that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And anyone who doesn't evaluate that and take, kind of inventory of themselves against that backdrop just simply isn't looking. We all have sinned. We've all fallen short of the glory of God, except for one, and that's Jesus. He says, for I always do what pleases him. What follows is going to be a couple of statements that are just very famous verses, very famous statements from Jesus. But I think for you and me, hopefully we're studying, we understand the context they happen within. So let me show you two of the most famous out of the New Testament or the Gospels. To the Jews who had believed him, Jesus said, if you hold to my teachings, you're really my disciples. And he says, then you'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free. People use that line all the time. People use that line in present day culture of you'll know the truth and truth will set you free. They don't understand that the context of it is Jesus pointing people to himself. They don't understand that it is in the context of Jesus pointing people to himself at the conclusion of the Feast of Tabernacles, and his declaration, front side, backside. Front side, I'm the living water, I'm the light of the world. Backside, he's going to say, I'm the great I am, basically. So it's understanding who Jesus is. Understanding that truth will set you free. Understanding political truth? No, not going to set you free. Understanding cultural truth? No, that's not setting you free. Understanding, just what people want to be true? Not at all. Understanding who Jesus is. That is what will set you free. Now, another famous line comes. Jesus replied, I tell you the truth. Everyone who sins is a slave to sin. Now, a slave has no permanent place in the family, but a son belongs to it forever. So if the son sets you free, you'll be free indeed. So this idea, many people in church will say, whoever the son sets free is free indeed. Once again, that coming from the truth, and the truth being who Christ is. And John chapter 8 is so strong in its Christology, who Christ is, and in the context of what was happening in the Feast of Tabernacles. Now this is going to continue to escalate. The Pharisees are going to say Abraham is our father. Jesus is going to say, you actually belong to your father, the devil, and you want to carry out your father's desire. He was a murderer from the beginning, not holding to the truth, for there's no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native language, for he's a liar and the father of lies. And then that's going to create a real push and attention around father pertaining to Abraham. So watch what it says here in verse 53. It says, are you greater than our father Abraham? He died, and so did the prophets. Who do you think you are? Because Jesus is just indicating that the validation that Abraham pointed towards Christ, or that Abraham rejoiced, it's going to say in just a few verses, rejoiced at the coming or the seeing of the day of the Lord. And they're saying, you have no connection to Abraham. Watch what it says here. Jesus replied, if I glorify myself, my glory means nothing. My Father, whom you claim as your God, is the one who glorifies me. Though you do not know him, I know him. And that's going to create even more tension, and it's going to spearhead here at this last set of statements in chapter 8. Jesus says, your father, Abraham, rejoiced at the thought of seeing my day. He saw it and was glad. Now watch this, verse 57. You are not 50 years old. the Jews said to him, and you have seen Abraham? That's more of a question mark. So they're saying this very sarcastically. I tell you the truth, Jesus answered, before Abraham was born, I am. Big statement. All of John 7, all of John 8, all of Feast of Tabernacles, pointing to the one who had provided for Israel in the wilderness. Remember, Feast of Tabernacles, Feast of Booths, remembering how God had provided for the Israelites in the wilderness. That was Moses. And God had provided water from a rock. God had provided manna. And God led them by a pillar of fire where there was light in their direction. And in review of that, in remembrance of that, Jesus is saying, I'm the living water, and if anyone wants it, I'll give you water that'll flow from you for the remainder of your life. I am the light of the world, and whoever comes to me will never be in darkness. And then he's concluding that I and the Father, we are in relationship, and I am. You'll remember that in the Old Testament, that the great I am was connected to God alone. Because Moses asks the Lord, who am I supposed to tell sent me? And the Lord tells Moses, you tell the people I am. And so Jesus is making such a divine claim here. Now let me pause that for a second. Why did they say you're not 50 years old? Well, if you look for yourselves in Numbers chapter 4, the age range assigned to the priesthood was 30 to 50. It says it multiple times. The age range for the priesthood was 30 to 50, and it was held that you were constantly learning, you were constantly in development all the way up. You never hit a point that you were fully mature. You never hit a point that you fully understood all things. So they're grabbing this number at the completion of what a priest would be, who might be in the description of seasoned and mature and well-versed. And they're saying, you're not well-versed. You're not mature. You're not in that category. So that's why they say you're not 50 years old. And Jesus is saying, before Abraham, I am. Well, that statement of divinity, anyone who says Jesus doesn't claim to be God, you just have to eliminate John chapter 7, 8, and 9 for that to be true, because John chapter 7, chapter 8, chapter 9 are statements of divinity. And certainly here in verse 8, at this they picked up stones to stone him, but Jesus hid himself, slipping away from the temple grounds. So he's slipping away from the temple grounds. Now, John chapter 9 is going to carry out on a Sabbath. I'm going to tell you, my opinion is that even though he has slipped away from the temple grounds, he is still in Jerusalem, and the things that are going to happen are in Jerusalem in John chapter 9. It's my understanding, along with numerous scholars, that John chapter 9 is still happening on the same day, not on a latter day. So let's read it. As he went along. So if we're accurate that this is still happening on the same day, which would be that 8th day following the Feast of Tabernacles, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, but this happened so that the work of God might be displayed in his life. And, that's a really hard set of statements, because we all struggle to understand the problem of evil. When evil happens, or suffering happens in the world, or suffering happens in the lives of people we know and we care about, there is that natural reaction to say, Lord, why? Why did this happen? In the ancient, it was held that if evil or suffering happened, that it was brought about because of one's own guilt or sin. So the disciples are saying, did they sin? Did the parents sin? Like, who is the cause for this pain and suffering? And Jesus is going to say pain and suffering isn't always understood in that context. Sometimes there are things that are for the glory of God, as well as I'll put the category sovereignty of God. It sits in the sovereignty of God. Maybe you've dealt with some things that sit in the sovereignty of God. You don't understand why you faced it. You don't understand why your loved one's gone through it. But yet, the Lord will use it for His name and for His glory. Well, we can take a lot of confidence from how this story plays out in John chapter 9 for us if we deal with suffering of different degrees that have come by way of just simply the sovereignty of God. So it's going to say here, he's going to say in verse 5, while I'm in the world, I am the light of the world. He comes back to the same statement about light. Having said this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, put it on the man's eyes. Go, he told them, wash in the pool of Siloam. This word means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. So let me push again. He says, go. He's left. Jesus has left the temple grounds. He's going to find a man born blind. He's going to send him to the pool of Siloam. And then that man's going to eventually, you'll see, return to the temple. So let me show you the image we saw earlier. Remember the pool of Siloam, very instrumental in the Feast of Tabernacles for those 7 days. On the 8th day, Jesus has left the temple grounds, being that which would be within that wall, and he has found a man who has been born blind. He sends him down to the pool of Siloam, and this man is going to be healed. I'll pause this for just a second and show you just a quick clip. This is us. This is the people that you see are Bridgeway people. I'm going to push pause here. These are Bridgeway people. We took a trip in 2018 and in 2023. And these steps, you'll see that there are wood steps. Those aren't ancient, but you'll see the stones that are being stood upon and the steps of stone. Those are of ancient antiquity. And as it pans around, there would be this open pool area. We are at, in this video, it's very short, we are at the pool of Siloam. And so this will pan out, and I'm going to pause it again because there are excavations happening out here. I'll try and pause it. There are excavations happening. This area is drained entirely right now, or was when we were there in 2023, because more discoveries are being made of deeper areas. But this would have been the territory that this pool of Siloam. Now, if the video continued to pan in the same direction, you can walk the escalated hill to the temple. You can walk on the path that would have that the priests themselves would have climbed, and you can look at the ground, and it's very ancient stonework, and that travels just along this, as you can see, coming from the pool all the way up to the temple. Now, last thing that I'll say about this image before I leave it, you see the X? I put that X there simply for context of spacing. That's where the Garden of Gethsemane is. So just in context, where the X is Garden of Gethsemane, and Mount of Olives goes up that hill. From the X to the temple, that little ravine is called the Kidron Valley. Jesus crosses the Kidron Valley to go up the Mount of Olives. On the night that he's betrayed, he crosses the Kidron Valley, goes over to Garden of Gethsemane, and then he is brought back over into the Jerusalem area. But anyway, that's a look at where the pool of Siloam was. So it says back in the scripture, it says, his neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg? Some claimed that he was. Others said, no, he only looks like him, but he himself insisted, I am the man. So they have a man who has been healed and now is seen and walking, and they're like, is this him or is that somebody different? And there's a bit of brouhaha that starts to happen. What ends up taking place, because this is happening on the Sabbath, this man is going to get brought to the Pharisees in the temple. So it says they brought to the Pharisees the man who had been blind. Now the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath. So they're bringing him there because this is happening on the Sabbath. I would hold, as well as a lot of scholars would hold, this is happening the day after Feast of Tabernacles is finished. And it says, therefore the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. He put mud on my eyes, the man replied, and I washed, and now I see. He has no idea about Jesus. And some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. But others asked, how can a sinner do such miraculous signs? So they were divided. So this real brouhaha in chapter 9 starts. Chapter 7 had tension. Chapter 8 had tension. Now chapter 9 has tension, all happening within the same 48 hours for the most part. And the Pharisees are going to be trying to get this man to give information about Jesus, but he doesn't know. He was blind. He didn't see. He just obeyed what was told to him. A second time, they summoned the man who had been blind. Give glory to God, they said. We know this man is a sinner. He replied, whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see. Now, what's going to happen here in these verses is there's going to continue to be back and forth. Right before this verse 24, there was the questioning of his parents from verse 17 to 23. The Pharisees went to his parents trying to get a credible explanation. Certainly your son wasn't blind. Yes, he was blind. Okay, something happened. They're trying to get data. And so they come to him, they're questioning him a second time. Finally, the Pharisees and this healed man are going to come into kind of conflict. And it says, then they hurled insults at him, the man who had just been healed. You are this fellow's disciples. We are disciples of Moses. This back and forth. And it says, if this man were not from God, he could do nothing. To this they replied, you were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us? And they threw him out. So what happened in between verse 28 and verse 33 is this healed man is giving some kind of retort to him, just defending Jesus, not really knowing who he is, but just defending. All I know is I was blind and now I see. And the end result is they throw him out of the temple, right? That's what it means. And they threw him out. Well, Jesus had left the temple grounds, right? So watch this. Jesus heard that they had thrown him out, and when he found him, so they are outside of the temple grounds. When he found him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? Who is he, sir? The man asked. Tell me so that I may believe in him. And Jesus said, you have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you. Then the man said, Lord, I believe, and he worshiped him. Now, there's a couple more statements that we're going to see in just a second. But remember, the predominant theme for John is about believing in Jesus as the Son of God. Jesus is dialoguing with this man, and this man says, I believe. So the last three statements in John chapter 9, Jesus said, for judgment I've come into this world so that the blind will see and those who see will become blind. There is a measure of metaphor to this. Some Pharisees who were with him heard him say this and asked, what? Are we blind too? They see his sarcasm and they are pushing against Jesus. And Jesus said, if you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin, but now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains. He's simply depicting, you think you see things and yet you're blind. And yet those who do not see, sight is coming to them. Those who did not believe are being given the opportunity to believe. And you think that you believe, but you truly don't. You don't believe. And so this is how John chapter 9 ends. The thing that I would leave you with is the consistent theme of the Gospel of John is believing in Jesus as the Son of God. And then the evidence of Jesus' miracles and teachings was received by some, but also rejected by others. When you take, and I think it's worthwhile, to take John chapter 8 and 9, see it in the context of John 7, see those three chapters together, see it within the Jewish holiday of the Feast of Tabernacles, happening over 8 days within Jerusalem, you look at their customs, and you look at what Jesus is saying of himself, it takes on a tremendous amount of poignancy, where Jesus is depicting to not only be the water displayed that they were taken from Pool of Siloam, pouring at the altar, but why were they doing that? Feast of Tabernacles, remembering that God had provided water for them out in the wilderness all the way back in the days of Exodus. And Jesus is saying, I'm the water. I'm the one who provided you water. And then you have the illumination of the temple happening for that whole period of time, for that whole feast. And remembering that God had led Israel by a pillar of fire at night and a pillar of this cloud during the day. And Jesus says, I am the light of the world. And whoever's with me will never have darkness. And all this time the Pharisees are saying, well, we have Abraham as our father. And Jesus says, before Abraham, I am, which is a statement of both Abraham and Moses. He is depicting his divinity as God. And he is inviting all of us to believe, to not be ones that think we have sight and actually we're blind. We think we don't need God. We think we're our own source of water. We think we're our own source of light. We think we're our own source of healing. Or if we recognize our tremendous need, then we are able to receive and gain sight and believe and worship, much like this particular gentleman did, as John chapter 9 is concluded. And so that's a look at John chapter 7, 8, and 9. And I think it's just some of the best in the Gospel of John. I hope that's been interesting to you. I know there are a number of verses that we had to leap over just simply for the sake of time. We'd love to have you go back and read through those things, think about them, study them, and just see the poignancy and the power and the presence of Jesus as the Son of God. Hey, with that said, I hope you'll join me for John chapter 10 as we touch on one of the famous lines throughout all of the Gospel of John, where Jesus says, I've come that you might have life and life more abundantly. God bless you, and I'll see you on the next part.